I knew the rules of engagement with Olivia Smith. Absolute precision, zero emotional leakage, and a professional distance measured in light years. But the image that shattered my career wasn't a spreadsheet or a scandal. It was the sight of the Iron Lady kneeling on her office floor, her wrists bound in intricate red silk, eyes closed in a state of transcendent, terrifying peace. I was supposed to be a ghost, a former employee retrieving a forgotten file. Instead, I was the witness who saw the structural weakness in the fortress. And once you see the vulnerability behind the armor, you can never look away. For 3 years, I was the architect of her invincibility. My official title was Director of Strategy, but in the rarefied air of the 42nd floor, I was a high-altitude fixer. Olivia Smith didn't just run a conglomerate. She embodied a kind of terrifying, beautiful efficiency. She was a woman who treated chaos like a personal insult. I watched her dismantle competitors with a single sentence and negotiate mergers without blinking, her face a mask of unflinching calm. My job was to ensure that nothing, absolutely nothing, cracked that mask. I managed the variables, smoothed the friction, and filtered out the messiness of human error before it ever reached her desk. We worked in a world of glass and chrome, a sterile environment where personal lives were treated as inefficiencies to be eliminated. I knew her coffee order, black, specific temperature, her schedule down to the minute, and her silence. But I didn't know her. There was no space for it. The air in that office was always thin, recycled, and scrubbed of anything organic. We were two minds synchronized in high-stakes problem-solving, existing in a vacuum. It was intoxicating, that level of competence. But it was also starving me. I left because I forgot what it felt like to exhale. I didn't quit out of anger. I quit because I realized I had spent 1,000 days holding my breath, terrified that a single moment of humanity would bring the whole structure down. I had been gone for 2 weeks. The detox was slow. I was just learning to sleep without my phone taped to my hand when I realized I'd left the prototype drive, the physical key to the legacy project, locked in the safe of my old office. It was a rookie mistake, the kind Olivia would have eviscerated me for. I couldn't call her. I couldn't admit the error. I had to fix it in the dark. I swiped my keycard at the service entrance at 11:45 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday. The light turned green. Security hadn't purged my access yet. That was the first breach. The elevator ride up felt like an ascent into a different atmosphere. My ears popped. When the doors slid open, the silence of the floor hit me like a physical weight. Usually, this place vibrated with the low hum of anxiety and ambition. Now, it was a tomb. The floor-to-ceiling windows turned the city lights into smeared abstract paintings, cold and distant. I walked down the main corridor, the sound of my own breathing loud in the stillness. It smelled of industrial cleaner and the lingering, expensive scent of ozone that always seemed to trail Olivia. It felt illicit being here. I was a civilian now, trespassing in a war room I used to command. I moved quickly to my old office, the ghost of my former life sitting in the chair. I retrieved the drive, the cold metal grounding me. I should have turned around. I should have walked straight back to the elevator and disappeared into the rain. But the layout of the floor was designed to funnel everything toward the corner office, the penthouse suite, Olivia's fortress. It should have been dark. It should have been empty. But as I stepped out of my office, I saw it. A single, warm line of light spilling from beneath her double doors. It wasn't the harsh, fluorescent glare of late-night work. It was dim, amber, almost inviting. The silence that flowed from that room wasn't the empty silence of the hallway. It was charged, heavy with presence. I knew I should leave, but the pull of that light was stronger than my survival instinct. I walked toward it, drawn by a curiosity that felt dangerous, my footsteps swallowed by the plush carpet, moving toward the one thing Olivia Smith never allowed anyone to see, her unguarded self. The door yielded with a soft, hydraulic sigh, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet corridor. I had prepared a dozen apologies for the intrusion, a forgotten file, a security glitch, a sudden need to check on the legacy data. I had rehearsed them all in the elevator, ready to deliver them with the deferential efficiency of a good employee. But the words died in my throat, turned to ash by the sheer, impossible reality of the tableau before me. The room was dim, lit only by the amber glow of the city filtering through the rain-streaked glass, but it was bright enough to see the destruction of everything I thought I knew about Olivia Smith. She wasn't behind the desk. She wasn't pacing with a headset, barking orders at Tokyo or London. She was in the center of the room, kneeling on a dark yoga mat, engaged in an act of such precise, deliberate restriction that my brain refused to process it. She had shed the armor. The sharp-shouldered blazer was draped over a chair. The immaculate white blouse was gone. She wore a simple black tank top that left her arms and shoulders bare, skin I had never seen in 3 years of working inches away from her. But it wasn't the nudity that froze me. It was the rope. A length of deep, crimson jute was wound around her left arm, biting into the bicep, spiraling down to her wrist in a complex, geometric pattern. The rope itself looked treated, smelling faintly of oil and beeswax, a scent that cut through the sterile ozone of the office. She wasn't struggling. She was working. Her right hand moved with the dexterity of a surgeon, looping the rope, pulling it taut, testing the friction. It was a self-suspension knot, or the beginning of one. I saw the red indentations where the fibers pressed against her pale skin, a map of pressure and release. This was the boardroom where we had acquired 3 tech startups and liquidated a logistics firm. It was a cathedral of capitalism, a place of cold, hard surfaces and intellectual dominance. And here was the high priestess, binding herself with a material that spoke of ancient, tactile surrender. The contradiction was dizzying. It was like finding a wild, tangled garden growing in the middle of a server room. She wasn't in pain. Her face was slack, her eyes half-lidded, but intensely focused on the knot. It was a look of transcendent, meditative concentration. She was finding silence in the constriction, using the rope to hold herself together when the world demanded she expand endlessly. I should have backed out. The ex-employee protocols demanded I retreat, wipe the security footage, and never speak of this. But I was rooted to the spot. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and a sudden heavy heat that pooled low in my stomach. It felt voyeuristic, yet she wasn't hiding. It felt intimate, yet she was alone. I watched the way her muscles tensed as she pulled the knot tight, the way a single drop of sweat traced a line down the column of her neck. It was the most human thing I had ever seen her do. It was raw, it was messy, and God help me, it was fascinating. I was seeing the machinery underneath the facade, the desperate need for containment that fueled her brilliance. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the soft creak of the rope as she adjusted the tension. Then the rhythm broke. She didn't gasp. She didn't scramble for a towel or a robe. She simply stopped moving. Her head tilted slightly, acknowledging the shift in air pressure caused by the open door. Slowly, with the terrifying grace of a predator that knows it has no natural enemies, she turned her head. Her eyes met mine. They weren't the cold, calculated eyes of the CEO. They were dark, dilated, blown wide open by the endorphins of the ritual. But the gaze was unflinching. She looked at me, standing there in my dripping raincoat, clutching a hard drive like a shield, and she didn't blink. She finished the movement, pulling the final loop tight, locking her wrist against her arm. She flexed her hand, checking the circulation, ensuring the bind was safe. The shame I expected to see was entirely absent. Instead, the air between us thickened, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She looked at me, and for the first time, I wasn't a subordinate. I was an intruder in her sanctuary. "You're letting the draft in," she said finally. Her voice was a shock, husky, lower than usual, stripped of its corporate polish. It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in smoke. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me. It was an automatic response, a reflex honed by 3 years of jumping whenever she spoke. But as the latch engaged, sealing us in that amber-lit room, the absurdity of the situation washed over me. I was standing in a wet raincoat, clutching a hard drive, while the most powerful woman in the city knelt on the floor, trussed up in red silk like a secret she kept from herself. "I didn't see anything," I lied, my voice sounding thin in the pressurized silence of the room. "I just needed the drive. I'm leaving. You're a terrible liar, Olivia said. She didn't rise. She didn't try to hide the ropes behind her back. Instead, she shifted her weight, sitting back on her heels with a casual, terrifying elegance. She lifted her bound left arm, inspecting the geometric pattern of the jute against her skin as if it were a quarterly report she was auditing. And you're not leaving. You're analyzing. I can see the gears turning. You're trying to reconcile the CEO with the woman on the floor. It's a difficult reconciliation, I admitted, stepping further into the room, despite every alarm bell in my head screaming for me to run. You don't do chaos, Olivia. You don't do this. This isn't chaos, she corrected softly, her eyes finally locking onto mine. This is physics. It's stress testing. You of all people should understand that. She flexed her fingers, the red rope tightening visibly against the pale flesh of her forearm. I spend 14 hours a day holding this entire company together. I am the structure. I am the load-bearing wall. Everyone leans on me. The board, the shareholders, the employees, they all push. She paused, the silence stretching between us, heavy and intimate. Sometimes, she continued, her voice dropping to a register that felt like velvet dragged over gravel, the structure needs to know it won't break under pressure. The rope doesn't hurt. It holds. It creates a boundary that I can feel. It's the only time I don't have to be in control, because the knot is doing the work for me. I stared at the red marks on her skin. It was a revelation. The Iron Lady wasn't binding herself for pain. She was binding herself to feel the edges of her own existence. She needed to feel contained because her power was so boundless, it threatened to dissolve her. Does it work? I asked. The question slipped out before I could filter it through my professional persona. Olivia smiled. It wasn't her boardroom smile, sharp and predatory. This was slow, lazy, and dangerous. It quiets the noise, she said. She held her arm out toward me, not asking for help, but offering the evidence. Come closer. Look at the precision. You appreciate precision, don't you? I shouldn't have moved. But the pull was undeniable. I took 2 steps forward, stopping just outside the circle of her yoga mat. Up close, the rope was intricate, a series of diamonds and triangles woven with a dark, mathematical beauty. I could smell the beeswax on the fibers, mixed with the scent of her skin, warm, alive, and shockingly close. It's tight, I murmured, my eyes tracing the path of the rope where it vanished under the strap of her tank top. It has to be, she replied. If it's loose, it's just decoration. If it's tight, it's a promise. She looked up at me then, her gaze traveling from my boots to my eyes, stripping away the ex-employee label I had been clinging to. You look shocked. Have you never wanted to be held by something stronger than your own schedule? Have you never wanted to stop driving the car and just let gravity take the wheel? I prefer to keep my hands on the wheel, I said, though my pulse was erratic, betraying me. That's why you burned out, she said simply. You tried to be me, but you didn't have a release valve. She lowered her arm, the tension in her shoulders dropping. Get your drive, go home, but don't pretend you didn't see this. We don't do false pretenses, you and I. I retreated to the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. This changes things, I said, looking back at her. She was a dark silhouette against the rainy window, bound and beautiful. Everything changes, she said. That's the point. I walked out into the cold hallway, the image of her bound wrists burned into my retina. I thought I had escaped the gravity of the penthouse, but I was wrong. The physical door had closed, but the digital ones were about to fly wide open. I spent the next 48 hours trying to rebuild the firewall. I told myself that what I had seen in the penthouse was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of a woman who didn't make mistakes. I tried to categorize it as a private medical necessity, like physical therapy, or a bizarre form of meditation that didn't involve me. I went back to my apartment, which was safe and quiet and devoid of red ropes. I drank cheap wine. I updated my resume. I tried to convince myself that I was still the ex-employee, a civilian who had escaped the war zone. But the brain is a traitorous organ. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see spreadsheets. I saw the precise geometric cage of jute around her arm, and the terrifying clarity in her eyes. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the first breach occurred. It was 11:43 p.m. My phone, which I had rigorously ignored for 2 days, buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up the dark room with a harsh blue glow. It wasn't a number I had saved. I had deleted her contact info the day I quit. But I knew the area code. I knew the cadence. Tension is just energy held in place. If you remove the tension, the structure doesn't relax. It collapses. There was no signature. No hello, no how are you, no please forget you saw me tied up on the floor. Just a philosophical assertion about physics delivered in the middle of the night. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. This was the test. If I ignored it, I was holding the line. If I replied, I was stepping back onto the game board. I watched the cursor blink, the blue light harsh against my retinas. I should have turned the phone off. Instead, my thumbs moved before my common sense could intervene. Structures also have yield points. Push them too hard, and the material fatigues. It's not a collapse, it's a failure. I hit send and threw the phone onto the duvet as if it were a live grenade. The response came 30 seconds later, vibrating against my leg. Fatigue is only a risk if the material is weak. High tensile steel doesn't get tired. It just gets harder. We didn't mention the rope. We didn't mention the office. But we weren't talking about steel, and we both knew it. We were talking about her. We were talking about the look she had given me, the challenge. For the next week, this became the ritual. The days were silent, but the nights were loud with text. She dismantled my professional distance one message at a time, using the language of our trade to explore something far more volatile. She would send articles about brutalist architecture with notes like, honesty in materials, nothing hidden. Do you miss the clarity? She was wooing me, not with flowers or compliments, but with intellectual friction. She knew that my brain was the erogenous zone she had to conquer first. I tried to keep my replies neutral, defensive. I played the role of the cynical consultant. But I found myself waiting for the buzz. I found myself checking the time at 11:40 p.m., my body humming with a Pavlovian anticipation. She was encroaching on my safe, boring life, turning my bedroom into an extension of her penthouse. The professional boundaries I had prized were dissolving into pixelated intimacy. Then came the pivot. 7 days after the incident, the tone shifted from theoretical to logistical. I have a new acquisition, a historic property in the district. The foundation is tricky. I need a stress test. I stared at the screen. You have a team of engineers, I typed back. You have a firm on retainer. They tell me what is safe, she replied instantly. I need someone who can tell me where the breaking point is. I need a consultation. Tomorrow night, neutral ground. It was a pretext. We both knew it. She didn't need my opinion on a foundation. She wanted to see if I would show up. She was calling my bluff. If I refused, I was admitting I was afraid of her, afraid of the pull. If I went, I was acknowledging that the game was on. I sat in the dark, the city humming outside my window, and realized I was bored of safety. I missed the ozone. I missed the danger of being the only person who knew the truth. Send the address, I typed. The coordinates arrived a second later. A high-end lounge downtown. Dark, quiet, expensive. Don't be late, she added. Precision matters. I put the phone down, my pulse racing. I told myself it was just business. I told myself I was just going to close the loop. But as I lay there in the dark, I knew I was lying. I wasn't going to fix a foundation. I was going to see if the walls would finally come down. The location she chose was the Vault, a subterranean lounge that felt less like a bar and more like a secret society meeting ground. It was all dark leather, low amber lighting, and the kind of heavy, hushed atmosphere where conspiracies were born. I arrived 5 minutes early, clinging to the last shreds of my professional discipline. But Olivia was already there. She sat in a high-backed booth in the far corner, a glass of amber liquid catching the dim light in front of her. Seeing her in public again was a physical shock. She was back in the uniform, a charcoal suit tailored to within an inch of its life, a silk blouse buttoned to the throat, her hair pulled back in that severe architectural chignon. To the rest of the room, she was Olivia Smith, the CEO who ate competitors for breakfast. But as I walked toward the booth, I didn't see the suit. I saw the ghost of the red ropes, I saw the woman kneeling on the floor. I knew that beneath the pinstripes and the silk, her skin held the memory of the bind. It changed everything. The suit wasn't just clothing anymore. It was wrapping paper. "You're on time," she said as I slid into the booth opposite her. She didn't offer a handshake. Her hands were wrapped around her glass, fingers long and steady. "Old habits," I replied, placing my phone on the table face down. A declaration of undivided attention. "You said there was a foundation issue." "There is," Olivia said, a small, playful smile touching the corner of her mouth. "The property is complex. It has a historic facade that can't be altered, but the interior needs to be completely reconfigured to handle modern stress loads." "And the current engineers?" I asked, playing along. "What's their assessment?" "They think it's too rigid," she said, leaning forward slightly. The shift in proximity brought that scent of ozone and expensive florals into my space. "They're afraid that if we apply too much pressure, the whole thing will crack. They don't understand that some materials only reveal their true strength when they're under tension." "Tension is risky," I countered, keeping my voice level. "You have to know the yield point. If you bind a structure too tight, it doesn't get stronger. It suffocates." "Is that your professional opinion?" she asked, her eyes dancing with a dangerous light. "Or are we talking about something else?" "I'm talking about architecture," I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "You're the one talking about binding." Olivia laughed, a low, throaty sound that seemed to vibrate through the table. She reached for her drink, and the movement was deliberate. As she lifted the glass, the cuff of her blazer rode up. The sleeve of her silk blouse slipped back just an inch. It was a calculated wardrobe malfunction. There, on the inside of her wrist, right over the pulse point, was a faint, reddish line. It wasn't a wound, it was an impression. A temporary tattoo left by the bite of the jute rope. It was a mark of ownership, but she owned herself. I stared. I couldn't help it. My eyes locked onto that small imperfection on her pristine skin. It was undeniable proof that the texts, the late-night philosophy, the game we were playing, it was all real. She had been practicing. Maybe even this morning. Olivia didn't pull her sleeve down. She held the glass in midair, letting me look, letting me process the reality of it. "You're staring at the blueprints," she murmured. I snapped my gaze back to her face. She wasn't angry. She looked satisfied. "It's distinct," I managed to say. "It's a reminder," she said, setting the glass down but leaving her wrist exposed. "The control is a choice." Then her expression shifted. The playful teasing dropped away, replaced by a serious, assessing look. She leaned back, creating space between us. "I'm pushing you, aren't I? I'm blurring the lines. This isn't a consultation about a building, and we both know it." "No," I admitted. "It's not." "I need to check the calibration," she said, her voice dropping to a hush. "I am used to getting what I want, and right now, I want to know if you can handle the chaos I keep under this suit. But I also know the power dynamic here. I used to sign your paychecks. If this is too much, if I am making you uncomfortable, or if you want to walk out that door and go back to being a stranger, you say the word. I will delete your number and you'll never see the ropes again." It was an out, a genuine, clear exit ramp. She was handing me the keys to my safety. I looked at the door. It was 20 feet away. I could leave. I could go back to my quiet apartment and my boring life where no one tied themselves up in boardrooms. Then I looked back at Olivia. I looked at the faint red mark on her wrist and the challenge in her eyes. I realized that safety was just another word for stagnation. "I'm not uncomfortable," I said, leaning in, closing the distance she had created. "I'm intrigued, and I think you know that." Olivia smiled, and this time it was genuine. "Good, because the project is just getting started." "So," I said, nodding at her wrist, "the stress tests, did it pass?" "The structure held," she said, "but it needs a witness, someone to check the knots." She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I stood with her. We hadn't discussed a single actionable item for a real building, but we had signed a contract nonetheless. As she moved to leave, she didn't shake my hand. Instead, she reached out and brushed her knuckles against the back of my hand. It was a fleeting electric contact, barely there, but it felt heavier than a grip. "Saturday," she whispered. "The gala. Wear something that breathes. It's going to be stifling. She walked away without looking back, leaving me standing in the dim light of the vault, my skin burning where she had touched me, fully aware that I had just agreed to be the accomplice to her secret. The annual Industry Innovators Gala was a masterclass in suffocating opulence, held in the cavernous, glass-walled atrium of the City Museum. It was a room designed to make you feel small, filled with people determined to prove they were big. I stood near a limestone pillar, clutching a flute of champagne I had no intention of drinking, watching the ecosystem of wealth and ego churn around me. To anyone else, this was a party. To me, it was a stress test of the highest order. The air was thick with the cloying humidity of too many bodies and the sharp, metallic tang of ambition. But I wasn't watching the crowd. I was watching the center of gravity. Olivia Smith had arrived 20 minutes late, an entrance calculated to stop conversation. And it had worked. She moved through the room like a shark cutting through schooling fish, efficient, lethal, and devastatingly beautiful. She wore a gown of crushed velvet in a shade of midnight blue so dark it looked black, high-necked and long-sleeved. It was a garment of absolute containment, covering every inch of skin that the red ropes had marked. To the investors and board members circling her, she was the Ice Queen, returned to her throne, a monolith of corporate power. They saw the armor. I was the only person in the room who knew that beneath the velvet, she was likely mapping out the geometry of a suspension knot in her head to keep from screaming. The secret burned a hole in my pocket. I watched a senator lean in to whisper something in her ear, and a flash of irrational, possessive heat flared in my chest. He saw the CEO. He didn't know about the amber light in the penthouse. He didn't know that the wrist she used to hold her champagne glass bore the faint, fading memory of a bind she had tied herself. I felt like a spy, carrying state secrets, standing on the periphery of a war zone I used to manage. Then the dynamic shifted. Olivia was mid-conversation with the head of a rival tech firm when her eyes lifted, scanning the room with a predatory precision. Her gaze swept over the crowd, ignoring the desperate waves of junior executives, until it locked onto me. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply excused herself from a conversation worth millions of dollars and began to carve a path toward my pillar. The crowd parted for her not out of politeness, but out of instinctual self-preservation. She stopped 2 feet away, invading my personal space in a way that felt both aggressive and conspiratorial. She turned her back to the room, creating a sudden, private bubble of intimacy amidst the noise. Up close, the perfection of her facade was terrifying. Her makeup was flawless, her hair sculpted, but her eyes were dark with a restless energy. "You're hiding," she said, her voice low, cutting through the ambient roar of the gala. "I'm observing," I corrected, setting my untouched glass on a passing tray. "It's what you paid me for, assessing the structural integrity of the event." "And?" she asked, stepping closer. The scent of her hit me then, that signature mix of ozone and expensive, cold florals. But tonight, there was something else underneath. The warmth of her skin, the heat of someone running high on adrenaline. "The foundation is shaky," I murmured, holding her gaze. "Too much weight at the top. It feels like it could tip over." "Let it tip," Olivia whispered. A small, dangerous smile played on her lips. "I'm bored of balance. I've been shaking hands for an hour, pretending I don't want to tie them behind my back just to stop the fidgeting." The reference hit me like a physical blow. It was a direct line to the image of her on the office floor. She was teasing me, testing the boundary right here in the open. "You're playing a dangerous game, Olivia," I said, my voice dropping to a hush. "There are cameras everywhere." "I know," she said. "That's why I need a handler." She reached out then. To the room, it looked like a casual professional gesture, a CEO guiding a consultant. But as she moved to stand beside me, her hand slid around my waist and rested firmly on the small of my back. Her fingers spread out, the heat of her palm searing through the thin fabric of my dress shirt. It was possessive. It was a claim. She pressed her thumb into my spine, a subtle pressure point that forced me to arch slightly into her touch. "I practiced again this morning," she whispered, her lips dangerously close to my ear, hidden by the noise of the crowd. A double column tie. It was Strict. I'm feeling very contained tonight. But I think I missed a knot. I feel loose. The air between us crackled. I looked at her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, and realized with a sudden, clarifying jolt that I was done being the passive observer. I didn't just want to watch her bind herself. I didn't want to be the employee who stumbled upon a secret. I wanted to be the one pulling the rope taut. I wanted to be the source of the tension she craved. If you're loose, I said, leaning in so only she could hear, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart, then the structure is compromised. You need an emergency repair. Olivia turned her head, her eyes locking on mine with a dark, hungry intensity. She squeezed my waist, a sharp, grounding pressure. Meet me, she commanded, the playfulness gone, replaced by a raw urgency. The penthouse, 1 hour. The storm is picking up, and I don't want to ride it out alone. She pulled her hand away, leaving my skin cold where she had touched me, and walked back into the crowd without looking back. I checked my watch. 59 minutes. I turned and headed for the exit, leaving the gala behind. The party was just noise. The real event was waiting 40 floors up. The return to the penthouse felt less like a business meeting and more like walking into the eye of a hurricane. The elevator ride was a silent ascent through the building's spine, my ears popping as the numbers climbed higher, leaving the safety of the ground far below. When the doors slid open, the atmosphere hit me instantly. It wasn't the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the workday. It was wild. The storm that had been threatening the city all evening had finally broken, and at 42 stories up, you don't just watch the weather. You live inside it. The lights were killed, leaving the cavernous office illuminated only by the violent strobe light flashes of lightning tearing across the skyline. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass with a rhythmic fury, turning the panoramic view of the city into a blurred, weeping watercolor of gray and black. The steel frame of the tower actually hummed, a low-frequency vibration that I could feel in the soles of my feet. The building was swaying. Engineered flexibility, I knew, but terrifying nonetheless. Olivia was standing by the window, a silhouette against the chaos outside. She had shed the velvet armor of the gala. The gown was gone, replaced by the simple black tank top and loose trousers I had seen that first night. She was barefoot. The sight of her feet on the plush carpet felt shockingly intimate, a domestic vulnerability that clashed with the corporate fortress around us. "The elevators are in lockdown," she said, without turning around. Her voice was barely audible over the thunder that shook the glass. "Wind shear sensors triggered a safety protocol. We're stuck until the squall line passes." "Convenient," I said, dropping my bag on the leather sofa. The sound was swallowed by the room. "Is this part of the stress test? Trapping the subject in the environment to see if they panic?" She turned then. A flash of lightning cast her face in sharp relief, pale, serious, and stripped of the social mask she'd worn downstairs. "I didn't rig the weather, if that's what you're asking. But I'm not sorry about it. I needed the noise to stop. I needed the audience to leave." "The audience is gone, Olivia," I countered, walking toward the heavy oak conference table that stood like a DMZ between us. "So tell me what we're doing. You didn't ask me here to finalize a contract. You didn't touch me downstairs to discuss structural engineering. What do you want from me?" "I want to know if you can handle the truth of this," she said, walking to the head of the table. "Not the sanitized version I show the board. The reality." "I've seen the reality," I said, gesturing to the floor where I'd found her weeks ago. "I saw you on the floor. I saw the ropes." "You saw the result," she corrected. "You didn't see the need." She reached under the table and pulled out a bundle. It wasn't a file or a laptop. It was the red jute rope. She placed it in the center of the polished mahogany table. The coil sat there, heavy and textured, a chaotic, organic object disrupting the perfect surface of the corporate world. It looked like a heart on a sterile counter. "I told you this is about control," she said, her fingers resting lightly on the fibers. "But that's a half-truth. It's about trust. Do you know how terrifying it is to be me? To be the person who can never, ever slip? If I make a mistake, stock prices drop. People lose jobs. I have to be iron all the time. I have to be the wall that holds up the roof." She looked up, and the vulnerability in her eyes was devastating. It wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion. When I tie myself, it's the only time I can let go. It creates a physical boundary that tells my brain, you can stop now. You are held. But doing it alone, it's just management. It's maintenance. I've never let anyone else hold the rope. I've never trusted anyone enough to hand over the control. Why me? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The air in the room felt thick, pressurized by the storm outside and the confession inside. Because you didn't run, she whispered. That night, when you walked in, you saw the cracks in the foundation. You saw the raw, messy need. And you didn't look away with pity. You looked with recognition. She pushed the rope across the table toward me. It slid with a soft hiss, stopping inches from my hand. I don't want a consultant, she said, her voice steady now. I want a partner. I want someone who knows where the breaking points are and knows exactly how much pressure to apply. I want you to tie me. The storm raged outside, wind howling against the glass. But inside, the silence was absolute. The choice lay on the table between us. I could leave, wait by the elevators until the sensors reset, keep my hands clean, and go back to a life of safety. Or I could pick up the rope and step into the chaos with her. I looked at the red jute. I looked at her hands that signed billion-dollar deals, now waiting for my answer. I realized then that my boundaries hadn't been protecting me. They had been keeping me from the one thing I actually wanted, the weight of her trust in my hands. I reached out, and my fingers closed around the rough, warm texture of the jute. It wasn't just a length of fiber. It was a contract, heavy with implication. The moment I lifted the coil from the mahogany table, the air in the room shifted. The storm outside seemed to recede into the background, becoming nothing more than white noise against the sharp, terrifying clarity of what was happening between us. I wasn't the ex-employee anymore. I wasn't the strategist or the fixer. I was the one holding the line. "Stand up," I said. My voice was steady, surprising even me. It wasn't a request. Olivia didn't hesitate. She pushed back from the table and rose, her movements fluid but laced with a new kind of tension. She stood before me, the lightning casting long, frantic shadows across her face, but her eyes remained fixed on mine. She looked like she was waiting for a verdict. "Turn around," I instructed, stepping around the side of the table to meet her in the open space near the window. "Put your hands behind your back. Cross your wrists." She turned slowly, exposing the vulnerability of her back, the curve of her spine visible through the thin fabric of her tank top. She brought her wrists together, her shoulders rolling back, her chest opening up. It was a posture of absolute surrender, a physical contradiction to the woman who usually commanded rooms with a raised eyebrow. I stepped closer, the rope feeling alive in my hands. I draped the center of the coil over her wrists, the jute scratching softly against her skin. The sensation was electric, the friction of the rope, the heat radiating from her body, the smell of ozone and rain. "Tell me," I whispered, making the first loop, pulling it snug but not tight. "Is this okay?" "Yes," she breathed, her head tipping forward slightly. Tighter. "Precision, Olivia," I murmured, channeling the very lessons she had taught me. "We don't rush the foundation." I wrapped the rope again, weaving it between her arms, creating a separation that would keep the bones from grinding together. This is about structure. If I bind you too fast, the circulation cuts off. If I do it right, the rope becomes part of you. I pulled the line taut, feeling the resistance. "Check in. On a scale of 1 to 10, where is the pressure?" 4, she said, her voice sounding thick. "I need a 7. "You'll get a 7 when the structure is stable," I teased, my fingers brushing against her palms as I threaded the knot. It was an intimate dance, my hands moving with a deliberate slowness that was agonizing and necessary. I was mapping her. I was learning the topography of her tension. I could feel the tremors in her hands, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of letting go. "You're fighting it," I observed, pausing with the rope pulled halfway through a loop. "Your shoulders are up by your ears. You're trying to manage the knot for me." "It's a habit," she admitted, letting out a shaky breath. "I'm trying to optimize the efficiency." "Stop optimizing," I commanded softly, leaning in until my forehead was inches from the back of her head. "I'm the architect right now. You're just the building. Your only job is to stand there and let gravity do the work. Let me hold the weight." I felt the exact moment she stopped driving. Her shoulders dropped 2 inches, her breath hitched, then smoothed out into a deeper rhythm. She leaned back, just a fraction, trusting that I was there to catch the shift in balance. It was a terrifying amount of trust. I finished the knot, a simple, sturdy, square tie that locked her wrists together with absolute security. I pulled the final ends tight, bringing the pressure up to the level she craved. 7? I asked. 7, she confirmed, the word ending in a sigh that sounded like a lock clicking shut. I didn't step away. I couldn't. The ritual wasn't just about the rope. It was about the connection. I rested my forehead against her temple, my hand staying on her bound wrists, grounding her. We stood there in the dark, illuminated by the storm, breathing in sync. The Iron Lady had finally melted. She wasn't holding up the sky anymore. The rope was doing it for her. And I was holding the rope. You were right, I whispered into the silence. The boundaries were never about keeping us safe. They were just keeping us lonely. Don't let go yet, she murmured, leaning her weight fully against me. I'm not going anywhere, I promised. The contract has been renegotiated. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving the sky a bruised, tender shade of purple. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, pressurized quiet of the night before. It was the clean, washed-out stillness of a city resetting itself. We stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, 50 stories up, watching the first gray light filter through the clouds, turning the wet streets below into rivers of mercury. The red ropes were coiled back on the mahogany table, an innocent bundle of fiber again, but the ghostly sensation of them lingered on my fingertips. I felt the phantom weight of her trust, a permanent imprint on my skin. The office, usually a cathedral of intimidation designed to make visitors feel small, felt different now. The amber light was gone, replaced by the honest, unflinching morning sun. And yet the space felt softer, humanized by the memory of what we had shared. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was the site of a demolition and a rebuild. Olivia was buttoning her blouse. It was the same white silk, the same sharp collar that signaled authority. But the way she moved was different. There was a looseness in her shoulders, a fluidity that hadn't been there yesterday. She wasn't armoring up to fight the world. She was just getting dressed. I sat on the edge of the desk, watching her tuck the shirt into her trousers, covering the skin I had mapped with jute only hours ago. The secret was hidden again, buried under layers of expensive fabric and corporate expectation. But it wasn't lost. It was shared. And that changed the gravity of the room. You know, she said, her voice rasping slightly from the long night, catching my reflection in the glass. Technically, this is a gross violation of protocol. Fraternizing with an external consultant, misuse of executive time and company property. She gestured vaguely at the table where the rope sat, a chaotic element in her ordered world. Technically, I countered, keeping my tone light but steady, I'm an independent contractor, and I believe the invoice will list this under crisis management and structural reinforcement. You are unstable. I provided the necessary support. She laughed, a genuine, bright sound that seemed to crack the last of the corporate veneer. She turned to face me, the CEO mask sliding back into place, but it didn't fit as tightly as before. I could see the woman underneath. I could see the person who needed to be held. And more importantly, the person who had finally allowed herself to be caught. We can't go back, you know, she said, walking over to check her reflection in the dark monitor of her computer. I can't pretend you're just the strategist anymore. And you can't pretend you don't know exactly how to dismantle me. I don't want to go back, I said, standing up to meet her. I like the new layout. It has better flow. The old structure was too rigid. It was going to snap in the next high wind. She stopped adjusting her cuffs and looked at me, stopping just inside my personal space. The ozone scent was back, fresh and sharp, but now it was mixed with the memory of the storm and the warmth of the bind. She reached out and straightened my collar, a gesture of possessive care that felt louder than any command she had ever given. We have to be careful, she warned, her eyes searching mine. The board watches everything. The market watches everything. To them, I am still the Iron Lady. I am still the wall that doesn't move. If they see a crack, they'll attack. Let them watch, I said, covering her hand with mine, feeling the pulse beneath her wrist, the same wrist I had tied. They see the wall. I see the door. I know how to get in. And I know how to keep the roof from caving in when the pressure gets too high. We aren't employer and employee anymore, Olivia. We're accomplices. Good, she whispered, leaning in to press a brief, searing kiss to the corner of my mouth. Because I have a feeling the pressure is only going to increase. She picked up her blazer, shrugging into the sharp shoulders. She was Olivia Smith again, formidable and terrifying. But before she opened the double doors to let the morning and the world back in, she looked at me. It wasn't a glance, it was an anchor. It was a look that said, "I see you." A silent acknowledgement that while everyone else saw the skyscraper, we were the only ones who knew about the secret room in the penthouse. The contract was signed in invisible ink, binding us tighter than any knot I could tie. We spent years building walls to keep the world out, thinking safety meant isolation. But I learned that some walls are load-bearing, and others just block the view. You don't have to burn the house down to fix the foundation. Sometimes you just need to let someone else hold the keys to the dark room. If you want to see what happens when the blueprints get rewritten, subscribe for more stories about breaking the rules.